Once upon a time, in a small village nestled among the hills of Judea, there lived a woman whose name was never recorded, yet her story would be spoken of for generations. She was not a woman of power, nor was she a woman of wealth. She did not live in a grand home, nor did she wear fine garments or own fields of grain. She was a widow, a woman who had once known love and security, but who now carried the weight of sorrow on her thin shoulders. She had not always been alone. There was a time when her home, though simple, had been filled with warmth. When the low burning of the oil lamp in the evenings cast soft, flickering light against the clay walls. When the scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, and when her husband's deep voice filled the small space with laughter and gentle conversation. He had been a man of hard work and steady faith, one who spent his days laboring under the sun, his hands thick with calluses, but his heart full of love for the woman he had chosen to walk beside him. Each evening, when he returned home from his work, he would place a single coin in her hand, a token of his labor and devotion, a reminder that as long as he lived, he would provide for her needs. "It is not much," he would say with a smile, brushing the dust from his tunic before sitting beside her. "But it is ours, and the Lord has always given us enough." And for years, it had been enough. Enough to fill their small table with food, enough to cover their bodies in garments woven by careful hands, enough to reassure her that no matter how hard the seasons might be, she would never go without. She had believed those words with all her heart, until the day he did not come home. Grief had come suddenly, like a storm rolling over the hills without warning, like a shadow stretching across the land without mercy. One day, she was a wife, and the next, she was a widow, left behind in a world that was no longer soft and safe, but cold and indifferent. She had never known what it was to feel completely alone, to wake in the stillness of morning and reach for someone who was no longer there, to sit by the fire at night and hear nothing but the silence pressing in from all sides. The world outside her door did not slow for her sorrow. It did not pause to mourn the man she had lost. It continued as it always had, and soon the weight of survival became heavier than the weight of grief. The small savings they had tucked away, the few coins hidden carefully beneath their sleeping mat, had slowly dwindled to nothing. The neighbors who had once spoken kind words in passing now turned their eyes away, too busy with their own lives to notice a widow slipping deeper into poverty. She had once been the keeper of a home, the wife of a man who worked with his hands, the woman who wove baskets and baked bread and saved what little she could for the days ahead. Now she was invisible. Now she was a woman with nothing left to give. The last two coins sat warm in her palm, their weight small yet heavier than anything she had ever carried. She had counted them over and over again, running her fingers over the smooth metal as if they might multiply beneath her touch. She could have used them to buy a piece of bread, a handful of figs, something to ease the ache of hunger that had long since become a familiar companion. But as she closed her fingers around them, as she pressed them tightly into her hand, she knew in her heart that these coins were never meant for her. She could not explain it, only that she had been given breath in her lungs for another day, and that alone was proof that the Lord had not forgotten her. And so on this day, just as she had done every year before, she would walk to the temple, not as a woman with riches, not as a woman with power, but as a woman who had nothing left except faith. The air was thick with the scent of oil and incense as she approached the place where offerings were given, her steps slow but steady. Around her, men and women moved with purpose, their hands full of riches, their garments finely woven, their sandals crafted from leather instead of the simple cloth wrapped around her feet. She did not belong among them, yet she did not hesitate. Because what she carried in her hands was not just two small coins, it was her trust, it was her worship, it was everything she had left to give. She stepped forward, passing the wealthy men who dropped their coins into the offering box without a second thought. Their gifts large and impressive, their faces full of satisfaction. She felt their eyes on her, the unspoken judgment of those who believe that an offering should be something grand, something worthy of being seen, but she did not care. She lifted her hand. She let the coins fall. They made no great sound as they landed. No heads turned. No voices murmured in admiration. No one noticed at all, except for one, and that one was the only one who mattered. The two small coins lay at the bottom of the offering box, lost among the wealth of silver and gold that had been given by men who had plenty, men who would not miss what they had tossed in without a second thought. The widow stood for a moment longer than she should have, her hands empty now, her palms still warm from where the coins had rested just moments before. It was done. She had given all she had left, and there was no turning back. A quiet peace settled over her, though it did not erase the hunger twisting in her belly or the uncertainty that still loomed ahead like a shadow she could not outrun. She had chosen faith over fear, obedience over self-preservation, surrender over control. And yet, she still did not know what tomorrow would bring. Would she find enough to eat? Would her body continue to carry her forward when it had already been running on little for so long? Would she wake the next morning with nothing left but the same prayer she had whispered the night before? She did not have the answers. She only knew that her God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had never abandoned his people before, and he would not abandon her now. She turned to go, slipping away from the crowd, unnoticed and unseen, but as she moved toward the temple exit, something stopped her, or rather, someone. At the edge of the courtyard, a man stood among his disciples, his presence both quiet and commanding, his eyes filled with something she had not seen in the faces of the wealthy men who had walked past her just moments before. Compassion, understanding, as if he knew, as if he had seen. His gaze was not drawn toward the men who had given from their abundance, nor to the religious leaders who walked with self-important strides, their robes flowing behind them in a display of status. No, his eyes were fixed on her. She hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground, her breath catching in her throat. Why was he looking at her? Who was he? She had heard whispers of a teacher, a prophet, a man who spoke with an authority that no one had ever carried before. Could this be him? Could this be the one they called Jesus of Nazareth? She did not have to wait long for the answer, because in the next moment he spoke. "Do you see her?" His voice was not loud, yet it carried over the murmuring crowd, drawing the attention of those who stood near him. The disciples turned their heads, following his gaze toward the widow, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion. The men and women who had passed by moments before barely spared her a glance, but now all eyes were on her. The widow's breath caught in her chest. She had spent so long feeling invisible, so long moving through life unseen, unnoticed. And yet, here she was, standing in the center of his attention, in the gaze of the one they called Rabbi, the one whom people followed across cities, the one who healed the sick, who fed the hungry, who spoke of a kingdom not of this world. Why her? Why now? She lowered her eyes, ready to slip away, to disappear into the crowd once again. But then, he spoke again. This woman has given more than all the others." The words settled over the courtyard like the hush of dawn, still and reverent, heavy with a meaning that no one had expected. The widow's brow furrowed, and for a moment she thought she had misheard him. More. More than the men who had tossed in handfuls of silver? More than the merchants who had brought offerings greater than she had ever held in her lifetime. A murmur rippled through the people around him, some scoffing, others exchanging puzzled glances. One of the disciples, a man with a sharp gaze and rough hands, a fisherman perhaps, tilted his head. "Rabbi, how could she have given more? She put in only 2 small coins." The widow felt the weight of his words pressing into her chest, an old familiar shame rising in her throat. She had always been the woman who had too little to offer. Too little money, too little strength, too little value in the eyes of the world. But Jesus saw differently. He turned to the man who had spoken, his eyes steady, his voice calm but unshakable. "They gave out of their wealth," he said, his words carrying the weight of a truth that could not be ignored. "But she gave out of her poverty. She gave all she had to live on." Another hush fell over the crowd, and this time it was not the widow who felt small. It was them. The men who had come with their riches now stood humbled by the weight of her sacrifice. The religious leaders who had taken pride in their status now found themselves standing in the presence of a different kind of devotion, one that could not be measured in gold or silver. And the widow, the one who had spent so long being overlooked, dismissed, forgotten, was now being lifted up as an example of faith. Her hands trembled at her sides, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She had not given to be seen. She had not given to be praised. She had given because it was all she had left to give. She had given because her faith was not built on the security of wealth, but on the belief that God would provide even when there was nothing left to hold on to. And now, standing in the presence of this man, this teacher, this prophet, this one who saw beyond appearances into the very heart of a person's soul, she felt something stir deep inside her. Not fear, not shame, but something she had not felt in a very long time. Worth. She was not invisible. She was not forgotten. She was not just a widow with 2 small coins. She was a daughter of the Most High God. She had given all she had, and it had been enough. The crowd began to disperse, the murmurs fading into the hum of daily life, but the widow did not move right away. Jesus had already turned back to his disciples, his attention now on something else, his presence shifting like the tide, always moving, always pulling others toward him. But before he was gone, before she could slip away, he looked at her one last time. And when he did, he smiled. It was not the smile of pity, nor the smile of a man who looked upon her as something fragile or broken. It was the smile of a man who saw her faith and was pleased, and in that moment, she knew. God had accepted her offering. She had given her last 2 coins, and in return, she had gained something far greater than she had ever expected. She had been seen. She had been known. She had been loved. And that was worth more than all the silver in the world. The widow walked away from the temple with light steps, though she had never owned so little in her life. The 2 small coins, the last she had possessed, were gone. Yet somehow she did not feel the weight of loss pressing on her shoulders. She had walked in with nothing but faith. She had left with nothing but faith, and yet she felt richer than she ever had before. For so long, she had been invisible, just a shadow among the crowd, a woman without wealth, without status, without anything of value in the eyes of the world. She had spent years walking past the same merchants, the same priests, the same noblemen who never once looked her in the eye. But today, she had been seen. Not by the temple officials. Not by the wealthy men who had given far more than she ever could. Not even by the crowd who had witnessed her offering and dismissed it as insignificant. She had been seen by him, the teacher, the prophet, Jesus of Nazareth. And somehow, that was enough. More than enough. The streets stretched before her, winding paths of stone and dust, filled with men and women moving about their day, voices rising over the sound of donkeys braying, and merchants calling out their prices, but she did not hear them. Her mind was still caught in that moment, the moment he had spoken about her, the moment he had lifted her up before all those who thought they were greater than she was. She had not expected it. She had not even dared to hope for it. She had walked into the temple knowing that she was small, knowing that what she had to give was barely worth noticing. And yet, he had noticed. This woman has given more than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty. She gave all she had to live on. The words played over and over again in her mind, each time sinking deeper into the places of her heart that had once felt hollow, empty, forgotten. Had he really meant it? Had he truly believed that her 2 small coins had been more valuable than the handfuls of silver given by the wealthiest men in Jerusalem? It didn't make sense. And yet, in his eyes, it had been true. She pressed a hand to her chest, breathing deeply, her heart full of something she could not quite name. Had she ever been truly full before this moment? Had she ever given so completely, so freely, that she felt lighter because of it? She had spent so many years clinging to what little she had, rationing every coin, stretching every scrap of food, always worried that if she gave too much, there would be nothing left. But now, she had given everything, and she did not feel empty. She felt free. Still, a question lingered in the back of her mind. The same question that had been with her even before she stepped into the temple. What happens now? She had no more money. She had no family to depend on, no field to harvest, no business to trade from. She had given all she had to live on, just as Jesus had said, and so what now? Would God truly provide for her? Would she wake the next morning with nothing but an empty stomach and empty hands? She paused near the small well at the edge of the village, her fingers trailing along the worn stone rim. The heat of the afternoon sun pressed against her, and she realized how weary her body felt. She had not eaten since the day before, but she would not let fear sink its claws into her now, not after everything. "The Lord has always been enough," she whispered to herself, "and He will be enough for me today." She closed her eyes, tilting her face toward the sky, breathing in the stillness of the moment. And then, a voice pulled her back to the present. "Mother," a young girl's voice called softly, "would you like some bread?" The widow opened her eyes, startled. A girl, no older than 10, stood before her, holding out a small loaf wrapped in cloth. She had dark eyes, bright with kindness, her hands outstretched as if this simple gift was the most natural thing in the world. Behind her stood her mother, a woman the widow had seen before but had never spoken to. "We had extra from our meal today," the woman said with a smile, the kind of smile that came from generosity with no expectation of return. The widow hesitated, her hands hovering in the air, uncertainty curling around her heart. Hadn't she just been wondering if God would provide? Hadn't she just been questioning what would happen now that she had nothing left? And here, before her, stood a meal she had not asked for, given by someone who owed her nothing. A lump formed in her throat. She reached forward, taking the bread with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. The woman nodded. "The Lord provides," she said simply, and with that, she and her daughter turned and disappeared into the crowd. The widow stood there for a long moment, the warmth of the bread seeping into her hands, into her skin, into her very soul. She had wondered if God had truly seen her sacrifice. She had wondered if he would take care of her now that she had given everything away. And here was her answer. Not in the form of riches, not in the form of a grand miracle, but in a simple loaf of bread offered by a stranger who had no idea what she had done in the temple just moments before. Her eyes stung with grateful tears. He had seen, he had known, and he had answered. A breath of laughter escaped her lips, light and free, as she held the bread close to her chest. She had given all she had, and God had already given back to her. She turned, lifting her face toward the temple one last time, the place where she had surrendered her last 2 coins, the place where she had been seen by the teacher, the place where her faith had been tested, revealed, and strengthened all in one moment. And as she walked away, her heart no longer carried fear for tomorrow, because she now understood God had always been her provider, and he always would be. The widow walked through the quiet streets, the small loaf of bread held close to her chest, its warmth still lingering against her fingertips. The scent of it, the simple promise of nourishment, filled her lungs with something deeper than relief, assurance. She had questioned if God would provide, if he had truly seen her sacrifice, and yet here was her answer, given in the most ordinary and yet extraordinary way. She had given all she had, and already he had given back to her. It was not a fortune. It was not a miracle that would change the course of her life in grand and visible ways. It was bread for today, and yet something inside her told her that it was enough. She took a slow step forward, her mind wandering back to the moment when Jesus' voice had carried across the courtyard, lifting her offering above the wealth of silver and gold that had been given by men who had far more than she did. She has given more than all the others. She still struggled to understand. She had given so little, 2 small coins that could barely buy a piece of bread, and yet he had said that her offering was greater than all the riches of the wealthy men who had dropped their heavy purses into the temple treasury. Why? Why would her offering matter when compared to theirs? Wouldn't God be more pleased with the larger sums? Wouldn't those who gave out of abundance accomplish more for the temple than she had with her 2 small coins? But then she remembered something her husband had once said to her in the early years of their marriage when they were first learning how to trust God for their daily bread. "Faith is not measured in numbers," he had told her, his voice gentle but sure. "It is measured in what we are willing to give when we have nothing left to hold on to." She closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling softly as the truth of his words settled deep inside her heart. That was what Jesus had seen, not the amount she had given, but the trust behind it. She had not given out of her excess, out of a place of security where she could afford to let go of a few coins while still keeping a full purse at home. She had given everything without a single guarantee of what tomorrow would bring, and somehow that had been enough. The sun had begun to set now, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples, a reminder that another day was coming to an end. Her feet carried her home, the path familiar beneath her steps, though tonight she felt lighter than she had in a long time. She had given away everything she had. She had walked away with nothing, and yet she had been provided for. What would tomorrow bring? She did not know. Would there be more food after this meal? She could not say, but for the first time in a long time, she was no longer afraid of what she could not see. For years, she had worried over every coin, over every meal, over every uncertain tomorrow, trying to stretch what little she had as far as it could go, afraid that one day there would be nothing left. But now, she had already walked through that fear. She had let go of the last thing she had to hold on to, and yet, she was still standing. She was still breathing. She still had enough for today. She had learned something in the temple that day, not just from the words of Jesus, but from the act of surrender itself. She had nothing to fear, because she was not held up by the weight of silver and gold. She was held up by something greater. As she reached her small home, she stepped inside and set the bread down on the table. She had thought she would feel alone tonight, that the silence of the empty room would press against her just as it always had, but instead, it felt full of peace, full of something unseen but undeniably present, full of the knowledge that she was not forgotten. She tore a small piece of the bread and placed it in her mouth, savoring its warmth, feeling the way it filled her body with strength. Tomorrow she would wake up and step into another day. She did not know what it would bring. She did not know if she would have more food or if she would be given another gift, or if she would go another day with nothing but trust in her heart. But for the first time in a long time, she did not need to know, because God knew, and that was enough. As she finished her meal, she sat in the quiet of her home and whispered a prayer, not for riches, not for more food, not for an easier path, but simply for the faith to keep trusting one day at a time. And as the night settled over her, she laid down in peace, knowing that whatever came next, she would never again be afraid. The morning sun stretched across the village, casting long golden rays through the small window of her home, its warmth greeting her like a familiar friend. The widow stirred from sleep, her body still aching from years of labor, yet there was something different about this morning, something lighter. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she did not wake with a heart burdened by worry. She did not rise with the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest, reminding her of how little she had, of how much she lacked. She had given away the last thing she had to her name, yet she had not been abandoned. She had been fed. She had been seen. She had been provided for. And now she had faith that today would be no different. As she prepared herself for the morning, she reached for her small clay jar. The one where she had once kept her savings, where she had once stored away what little coins she could gather, stretching them as far as she could for as long as possible. Now, it sat empty. Yet as she traced her fingers over the rim, she did not feel the same dread that had once gripped her. For so long, she had measured her survival by the number of coins in this jar, by how much she had left, by how long she could make it last before she had to go searching for more. But now she understood something she had not before. Faith is not measured in what can be counted. Faith is not built on what the hands can hold. Faith is the decision to trust even when there is nothing left to grasp, and she had chosen trust. She stepped outside, the cool morning air wrapping around her as she walked toward the well. The village was already alive with movement. Merchants setting up their stalls, mothers gathering water, children laughing as they ran barefoot across the dusty ground. She was not alone in her struggles. Many of them had little to their names, living from one day to the next, uncertain of what the future would bring. Yet somehow, God provided for them all. She knew now that she was no different. She no longer had to carry her burdens in silence, no longer had to feel as if she was forgotten while the rest of the world moved forward without her. She had given all she had to the Lord, and the Lord had given something back, not wealth, not abundance, but something even greater: peace. As she pulled water from the well, she overheard the soft murmur of voices nearby, hushed but urgent, as if something had stirred excitement in the village overnight. She turned slightly, catching pieces of conversation from the women beside her. He is still here. Who? Jesus of Nazareth. Her heart skipped a beat. Jesus. The teacher. The one who had seen her, who had spoken her name without speaking it, who had lifted her offering above all the others, who had declared her faith to be greater than the wealth of kings. She thought he would have moved on by now, traveling to another town, another village, speaking to crowds far greater than this small gathering of simple people. Yet, he was still here. She pressed the rim of the clay jar against her chest, her pulse quickening. Had he stayed for a reason? Had he come for more than just those who had something to offer? Had he come for people like her? She had seen the way others spoke of him, the way they whispered his name with awe and hope, as if he were more than just a man, more than just a teacher. Some called him a prophet, others dared to wonder if he was the Messiah, the one the people of Israel had long awaited, the one who would bring the kingdom of God, the one who would restore what had been broken. She did not know if it was true. She did not know if she could even dare to hope for something that great. But she knew one thing. He had noticed her, and no one had ever noticed her before. The morning stretched on, the village alive with movement, yet she could not shake the feeling that something was about to change. She had already given all she had. She had already surrendered what little she possessed, and yet she could not help but wonder. Had her offering been only the beginning? Had the Lord been preparing her not just to give, but to receive? She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the crisp morning air, whispering a prayer that had no words, only surrender. Whatever comes next, Lord, I will trust you. She had nothing left in her hands, but she had faith in her heart. And as the day unfolded, as the world continued its endless rhythm, she knew that somehow God was about to do something far greater than she could ever imagine. The day moved forward like any other, yet something in the air felt different, as if the very heavens were holding their breath. The widow could not explain it, but deep inside she sensed that something was coming, something unseen but certain, like the first stirrings of rain before a storm. She carried her jar of water back to her small home, her mind restless, her heart still lingering on the conversation she had overheard at the well. Jesus is still here. The thought repeated itself over and over again, each time sending a strange shiver down her spine, though she did not know why. What did it matter to her? She had already seen him once. She had already given all she had already been seen, had already been lifted up in his words, if only for a moment. What more could she possibly expect? And yet, the moment she stepped inside her home, setting the jar of water on the small wooden table, she realized the truth that had been stirring inside her since the morning. She wanted to see him again. Not to receive anything, not to ask for food, for shelter, for wealth or security, but simply to hear his voice again, to listen as he spoke of things she did not yet understand, to see if there was something more for her than just surviving another day. She had spent her whole life waiting for provision, measuring her days by the weight of the coins in her hands. But what if she had been waiting for something greater all along? The streets were crowded by the time she stepped outside again, people moving quickly, their voices rising in waves of excitement, their eyes alight with expectation. She did not have to ask what was happening. She already knew. Jesus was speaking. She followed the movement of the crowd, weaving through men wrapped in heavy robes, merchants who had abandoned their stalls, young children clinging to their mothers' hands, all pressing forward, all desperate for a glimpse of the man who had spoken words that seemed to reach into the very souls of those who heard him. The widow did not know if she would be able to see him through the mass of people, but she moved forward anyway, drawn by something she could not name, something deeper than mere curiosity. As she approached the gathering, she could hear his voice, calm yet powerful, steady yet full of a kindness that carried over the crowd like the wind through the trees. She strained to listen, to catch the words as they reached her ears. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal." Her breath caught in her throat. "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal." She had spent so many years measuring her life by what she had or did not have, by the coins she could save, by the food she could gather, by the days she could stretch her provisions before needing more. But this man was speaking of something greater, something eternal, something beyond the hunger of the body and the worries of the mind. He was speaking of a treasure that could not be lost, a treasure that could not be counted, a treasure that could only be found in God Himself. And suddenly, she understood. Her 2 coins had not been a loss, they had not been a mistake, a foolish offering, a reckless gift given in desperation. They had been a deposit into a kingdom she had not yet seen, an act of faith that had lifted her beyond the struggles of this world and into the eternal hands of God. She had been storing up a treasure greater than gold, and she had not even realized it. The crowd murmured around her, the weight of his words settling over them, some with confusion, others with awe. The widow wanted to move closer, wanted to see his face, wanted to ask him if what she had done had truly mattered as much as he said it did. But before she could take another step, his eyes lifted, and he looked right at her. Her breath caught. Her feet froze in place. There was no question that he had seen her, just as he had seen her before, just as he had spoken of her before. And in that moment, she realized he had never stopped seeing her. She did not move, she did not speak, but she did not need to, because in his gaze, she already had her answer. Her offering had not been wasted. Her faith had not been unnoticed. Her life, small, quiet, hidden in the corners of society, had never been forgotten by God. Jesus gave her the smallest of nods, a barely perceptible motion that spoke volumes without a single word, and then he turned his attention back to the crowd, continuing to teach, to heal, to lead. The widow stood still, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. She had come looking for assurance, for understanding, for a reason to believe that what she had given was not foolishness, but faith. And now she had received it. She had given everything. And in return, she had gained a kingdom that could never be taken from her. She smiled softly to herself, lowering her head in a silent prayer of gratitude. Her pockets were empty. Her home was small. Her future remained uncertain. But she had never been richer, because she was known. She was seen. She belonged to the God who provided, who loved, who never let his children go unseen. And that was worth more than all the gold in the world. The widow lingered for a moment longer, her heart still racing from the way Jesus had looked at her, the way his gaze had pierced through the weight of her worries, the way he had answered her unspoken questions without her ever having to say a word. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, believing that no one noticed her struggles, that no one cared if she had enough to eat, if she had a home to return to, if she would survive another day. But she had been wrong. She had been seen. Not just in the temple, not just when she had dropped in her last 2 coins, but long before that, from the moment she had taken her first breath. She had never been alone, and she never would be. The crowd around her slowly began to shift, people murmuring amongst themselves as Jesus finished speaking and started to move through the narrow streets. Some followed him, eager for another teaching, hoping for a miracle, longing to touch even the hem of his garment. Others walked away, their minds turning over his words, wondering if they could truly trust in something they could not see, could not hold in their hands, could not measure by earthly standards. But the widow, she did not wonder anymore. She already knew. She turned and walked back toward her home, her steps light, her heart full in a way that had nothing to do with food or money or security. Her faith had carried her further than she had ever thought possible, had opened her eyes to a kind of wealth that could never be lost, never be stolen, never run out. For years, she had counted her coins, hoarded what little she had, stretched every morsel as far as she could, living with the fear that one day she would wake up and find that she had nothing left. But that fear had no hold on her anymore, because she had already lost everything. And still, she had been provided for. Still, God had given her what she needed, not riches, not abundance, but enough for today. And tomorrow, he would do the same. As she neared her small home, she found herself whispering a quiet prayer. But this time, it was not a prayer of desperation, not a plea for help, not the weary sigh of a woman who did not know what the next day would bring. It was a prayer of thankfulness. Thank you, Lord, for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for taking my small offering and making it something greater than I could have ever imagined. Thank you for reminding me that I am yours. She stepped inside, breathing in the scent of oil and spices, the air cool and still. Her small table stood in the center of the room, bare except for a few clay cups, a woven cloth, and the last of the bread she had been given the day before. She tore off a small piece and placed it in her mouth, savoring it, not just for the nourishment it gave, but for what it represented. God had provided once again, and he would continue to. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. And though the world around her did not change, though she did not suddenly become rich, though she still lived in the same small home and wore the same simple garments, she was not the same woman who had once clung to her last 2 coins in fear. She no longer measured her life by the weight of her possessions. She no longer counted her security in coins, no longer let hunger steal her joy, no longer let uncertainty shake the foundation of her trust. She gave more freely now, not because she had much, but because she had enough. Enough for today. Enough to share. Enough to know that God would never let her go without what she truly needed. And though her name was never written down, though she was never counted among the great or the powerful, though history would never recall the details of her life, Jesus had spoken of her, and his words would live on forever. Her 2 small coins had changed nothing in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of God, they had meant everything.